Blech. Island of Lost Souls, directed by Erle C. Kenton from 1932. Now, I watch a lot of stuff from all eras of cinema, right? And I love me a good old black and white horror movie. I love them. I love their atmosphere. I love the places that they take you. I'll go anywhere. I really, really will. And Island of Lost Souls has been on my watch list forever. There have been many times I always mean to buy it on Criterion, blind buy it, because I'm like, I know it's going to be good. I know I have to have this on physical media. And there's always some other movie that takes precedence where I'll go, let me get this. And so I've been putting it off. Finally, it was on Turner Classic Movies streaming, whatever. And so I was like, I logged in through Verizon or whatever. And I was like, all right, let's finally check this out. You got Bela Lugosi is in there. It stars Charles Laughton. Now, Charles Laughton was a actor, but he directed one film, and the film that he directed is considered to be it's a Southern Gothic noir classic. It's a masterpiece. It's you might have heard of it. It's called The Night of the Hunter, and it stars Robert Mitchum, and it's directed by the guy who plays Dr. Moreau in this movie. So Charles Laughton plays a guy named Dr. Moreau, okay? And but he directed Night of the Hunter. And that's, you always see Meatloaf's hands, love and hate in Rocky Horror Picture Show. That comes from Robert Mitchum's character, the preacher man, love and hate that he has tattooed on his hands. In any case, to now scale back and talk about the Island of Lost Souls. I grew up in the 90s. I grew up on the John Frankenheimer remake, whatever, retelling of that's known as the Island of Dr. Moreau. There's also one in the 70s, which I've never seen. And I believe that that's when they changed the name as well to Island of Dr. Moreau. I'm not sure I think the H.G. Wells book, this is based on an H.G. Wells book. I'm trying to remember, is the H.G. Wells book called The Island of Lost Souls or The Island of Dr. Moreau? Island of Lost Souls. Let's just do that. I should check that real quick. And the best part about these older films, they're only like an hour 5. Sometimes they're shorter, which is nice when they are. Okay, the original novel is known as The Island of Dr. Moreau, and that was written by H.G. Wells, was written like The Time Machine and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. H.G. Wells, incredible science fiction writer, that classic writer that we all are aware of. And so this got adapted in 32. This is considered to be, this is a pre-code horror movie. So there was a code that eventually got put in place. I forgot what the reason why specifically, what created the code. But the pre-code movies were always a little bit more grisly, a little bit more graphic, a little bit more extreme. Imagine this. Imagine if there was no censorship, if standards evolved into what they were like in like the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and you got graphic, like grisly horror, but in like the 30s and 20s. It doesn't exist, but if it did, and imagine if it did exist, holy crap, that would be insane. So this is considered to be kind of like extreme for the time. It's a pre-code movie. And the plot is an obsessed scientist conducts profane experiments in evolution, eventually establishing himself as the self-styled demigod to a race of mutated half-human abominations. It was like animals and animal hybrids in like the 20s and 30s and 40s were very popular. Bela Lugosi starred in a lot of films that feature like gorillas, like the next one we're about to talk about. And I get, it's great, man. Charles Laughton as Dr. Moreau is like devious and delicious and wonderful. And he just kind of has, he almost has he does have a Dr. Frankenfooter sort of vibe about him a little bit. In fact, we know, even though Richard O'Brien borrowed from the Old Dark House when he was writing Rocky Horror, you can absolutely get a sense that there's some DNA of Frankenfooter shared with Dr. Moreau from the Island of Lost Souls. And, I would pair this with The Most Dangerous Game, which also is pre-code and also from I think it was 31. And it's just also really great. It's, man being hunted by man. and just really kind of just a wonderful like genre film before genre films, I guess. I don't know. I gave it 3.5 stars. You have Bela Lugosi as the sayer of the law, and that's I forgot I was talking about how I grew up. I grew up on the John Frankenheimer remake in the 90s with Val Kilmer and Marlon Brando, and there's a great story that Ron Perlman tells on Mark Maron's podcast about working with Brando, and I'm not going to do it any justice, so I'm not even going to try and tell you what it is. But like, it just go listen to Ron Perlman talking about working with Marlon Brando on that remake. It just a fantastic story about like self-doubt and like staying the course even when your like own head is like preying on you. We should cover that story someday because it's just a wonderful, wonderful story to discuss. What was I saying? The creatures in this movie they just look like hairy men. They're not really the makeup is not that great. It's really not that gory. The Panther woman, who's played by Fariza Balk in 90s, she just has like really sharp fingernails. It does have a much happier ending than I would say the 90s one is so much darker. And it's so interesting because it came out in the 90s and like, you know, you would imagine that, I don't know, the worldview at the 90s was just a lot better. Like when you look at the worldview of Armageddon, the Michael Bay movie, compared and contrast to like what 9/11 would bring. You see the optimism of the 90s, and it's funny that the remake doesn't have that kind of same sort of optimism running through it. And it does here in this first film. It's great. It's just great. I love these old black and white movies. Everybody should watch this movie. And yeah, Bela Lugosi is great. He has a very small role. Apparently he was only paid $800 for the entire shoot. And he took the role because he was, you know, quite bankrupt at that time. And mind you, I think this was his first role after Dracula. Okay. So he's like 46, 47 years old when he made this movie. And he just looks like a really hairy guy. And he wears like a white button-down shirt. He's really strange looking. And yeah, you know, sayer of the law, man. You know, what is the law? What is the law? And eventually, obviously, Dr. Moreau gets his comeuppance from his creatures. It's interesting, too, the 1930s sensibilities, and we'll talk about this again in the next one, the idea of like what like genetic engineering looked like then versus what it does now, and or even what it did in the 90s. It's all very interesting to look at old-fashioned cinematic views of science fiction, I should say, because they try to talk complicated, and it, you know, ends up sounding even more like gobbledygook because what they were talking about was even more like, at least, you know how sometimes science fiction is like an approximation of what the truth could be, even though it's technically not true in and of itself. Kind of like Jurassic Park, like the science mechanics behind splicing frog DNA to fill in the gaps of dinosaur DNA, which I guess is not possible. What is it actually possible? I think they proved that maybe it was possible. What it was, the point was that there was some real logic. As they say on the podcast, the Writers Blockbuster podcast, the scientific mumbo jumbo was really sound in that movie versus, you know, the mumbo jumbo of back then sounds outdated now. I don't know what I'm talking about. Let's move on. Great movie, Island of Lost Souls. 3.5 stars out of 5.